Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kevin Allen. I'm joined by my podcast partner, Bob Duff, and this is the hockeydebates.com podcast. We come to you twice a week to talk all things hockey, even during the pandemic and even when there's little hockey to discuss. But there's a lot of hockey discussed today. And I particularly wanted the guest we have today because I think everybody was fascinated by the draft lottery. A lot of people were upset by the draft lottery. A lot of folks in Detroit, think that they're not going to get a great player anymore. And there's a man we have as a guest, Kyle Woodlief. I've known him for a very long time. He is the publisher and chief scout of Redline Report, and I'm sure everybody knows him. And in case you don't, that's the the best independent scouting service going. It's been around a long time. Kyle knows his stuff. He's a former NHL scout, and he's also I think very entertaining in the way he presents his reports. So anyway, it's a pleasure to have Kyle here as our guest. Kyle, thanks for joining us.
Great to see you again, Kim. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to see you live and in person in Montreal this past weekend.
Yeah, no, it's a shame that you're not going to have a draft. But let's start at that draft lottery. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about that. I thought Steve Yzerman handled it with class. He said, I looked at the odds and I knew that, that we weren't likely, to win. And so I'm not, all that surprised about it. But the results doesn't say we need to do something.
Yeah, I think you would have not expected anything less from Stevie Yzerman on that subject, and he's right. They really only had about a 1 in 4 chance of winning. So, but I do think that there should be some tweaks to the system because, in all honesty, the system was put in place, and all lotteries and all sports are put in place to prevent teams from tanking. And you're really, if teams are tanking, there's really not more than at most 2, maybe in a rare year, 3 of them, trying to race to the bottom to get a terrific player. So do you really need 15 teams in the lottery? I mean, you're not going to prevent the teams that are finishing with the 12th and 13th best records or worst records in the league from tanking by including them in a lottery. I mean, they're not tanking to start with. I tend to agree with what Brian Burke said after, in that I think you really only need to limit it to 5 teams. I think the teams with the 5 worst records in the league, whatever conference they come from, could be 4 from the Western Conference, 1 from the East, doesn't matter. Teams with the 5 worst records in the league should be included in the lottery. And that's all. I mean, you're not preventing teams from tanking by including 15 teams in the lottery.
Let me before I turn you over to Bob, let me throw something out and get your thoughts on this. I'm a pro lottery guy, and one of the things that I've sort of realized in the last few years is that there's now 2 levels of rooting for your team. There's the traditional one where you root for them to win, but now it is very socially acceptable to root for your team to lose to get a better draft position. And in fact, if you don't do that, many of your fellow fans think you are dumb and you don't know what you're doing. And let me give you an example. My NFL team, the Lions, they were going nowhere, and a lot of my relatives were rooting for them to lose. And I said, I'm too old. I can't do that. Like I intellectually, I understand how that works, and I get it, and I'm with you in spirit. But I want my team to win. I can't do that. But saying all that, what I think is, and I want to get your thoughts on it, that really all that's wrong is the percentages. Like, I think it's kind of fun when everybody has even a minuscule chance, even if it's 2%, to get in. But that's where that stays. So every once in a while we'll get an oddball and somebody will, jump up and win, and it'll be exciting. But I thought, like, if Steve Yzerman's Red Wings would have had a 70% chance to end up in the top 3, that would have been far more acceptable. Instead, they had like a 49.6% chance or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So what's your thoughts on that? That maybe it's just the percentages that need to be adjusted.
Yeah, I could go along with that line of thinking too, because, for me, say you did limit it to 5 teams, like I had suggested earlier. I don't think that the the team with the fifth worst record should have as big a percentage chance of winning the lottery as the team that finished with the worst record. So, I'm kind of pulling numbers out of thin air here, but it wouldn't, for me, it wouldn't be out of line if you had the team with the worst record having a 40% chance, the team with the second worst record having a 30% chance, 20% chance for the third worst record, and then, divvy it up, 5 and 5 for the fourth and fifth worst records in terms of having a chance to win the lottery. I'm in agreement with you. Again, I am a lottery proponent. You do have to prevent tanking, and I think you said there's two class of fans that are you're rooting on two different levels. You're rooting for your team to win, or you're rooting for your team to tank. And I think that's kind of an offshoot of fans having much more access to information on these players in all sports, not just hockey, but in all sports. 25, 30 years ago, when I started Redline, fans didn't have access to information like they have now. So, I think that they weren't as sophisticated about the players coming out. They didn't necessarily know who Alexis Lafreniere was. To say Lafreniere came out 25 years ago, when Mario Lemieux came out in 1984, people might have known who Mario Lemieux was, but anybody ranked from 2nd through 10th in that draft, nobody would have known. And I think now everybody has access to so much more information that they know who the 8th player picked it could be. They know the top 30 guys. They know the first round guys. And they have a little bit more in-depth knowledge. And they're saying, well, okay, if Lafreniere is so much better than everybody else in the draft, let my team tank and get it. And you also have to go back and say, okay, the Pittsburgh Penguins built a dynasty on getting Mario Lemieux first overall in '84, getting Sidney Crosby in 2005. They already had Fleury, who they took first overall in 2003. They won the lottery in 2004. I think they were supposed to pick 5th or 6th. Won the lottery, moved up to 2nd, and got Malkin. That was a draft that had 2 players and a steep drop off. And after Ovechkin and Malkin, Chicago was supposed to pick 2nd, dropped to 3rd, and got Cam Barker. So it's a pretty big drop-off from Malkin to Barker. So, I think players or fans didn't understand those sorts of things back then, and they understand it far more now.
Yep. So what you're saying is there was a time many moons ago when a team might not have done their homework and accidentally drafted Alex Lafreniere first instead of Alexis Lafreniere. I thought Hodge said it best when he talked about this draft lottery. He said, there should be a rule of thumb in sports. If your fans can't understand what's going on, it's probably a bad idea. And it just was such a convoluted, complicated formula. I thought, you change the playoffs so basically 24 teams are in. So change the lottery for 1 year where it's just the 7 teams that don't get to play in the playoffs. Because those teams aren't going to get to play a game for what might be 9-10 months. Right. Their fans need something to talk about.
Yeah, that's true. You need to keep markets like Phoenix and like Florida, non-traditional markets, they're not going to be talking about hockey if their teams aren't playing for 9 or 10 months, as you suggest. And so, the draft, especially in a time when other sports are paused as well, the draft could have been a big talking point in a positive way for the NHL. Instead, it's turning into a big talking point in a negative way for the NHL.
Kyle, I know the team tendencies and the characters that are doing the picks, as well as the kids that are going to be drafted. Do you think that Eisenman, if the 3 forwards go 1, 2, 3, will take Drysdale at the number 4? And if so, what do you expect him to be like over the next few years?
I don't expect Steve Yzerman to do anything other than to take the highest rated player on Detroit's board. And if that turns out to be Drysdale, so be it. Wouldn't be an off-the-wall pick. It wouldn't be my pick. I don't think, I have Sanderson and Drysdale at 6 and 7 on my list, basically interchangeable. but I don't think that they are as good as the first 5 forwards. I think a lot of people are saying Lafreniere is in his own category, his own tier, which is true. A lot of people are saying that Byfield and Stützle form the second tier. I kind of extend that out. I think Byfield is kind of in his own tier, and I think Marco Rossi, Cole Perfetti, and Stützle are all in the third tier together. And I think that's your top 5. And, I don't think that you can pass over a superior talent for somebody in a different tier. If I had, Drysdale and or Sanderson in the same tier as those forwards, then okay, fine, take them, take the defenseman. But I don't think they're quite on the same level as that tier of guys, the Perfettis, the Stützles, the Rossis. I think all 3 of those guys I would have ranked a slight tier higher than the 2 defensemen.
Yeah, with Steve Yzerman, it's always a battle to get any information out of him, and he keeps his organization locked down pretty tight. But I have heard some scuttlebutt from people in the organization that Yzerman is a fan of Askarov. Now, you can't take him at number 4, but obviously he got a pretty big building block in the first round in Tampa Bay with Vasilevsky, a lot later in the first round, certainly. But you think there's any chance if he got the right offer, he would trade down and then take Askarov maybe a little later in the first round?
I do think there's a chance of that. I mean, if he's really that enamored of Askarov, and he's the only first-round goaltender in this year's draft. He's a top 10 player. Starting the year, I had him in our top 3. I mean, he's the first goaltender I've had ranked in our top 3 in 17 years, I think, since Marc-Andre Fleury. So, he's a special kid. He didn't have the greatest year at the major international events this year. Still was very solid, back home and play during the leagues. So if they've scouted him thoroughly and really like him and have him, roughly in the same tier as the forwards, I could actually see them making it like that.
It's an area where they certainly don't have, and they have a lot of young goalies in their system that they've drafted and that are playing in their farm system, but there's nobody who jumps off the page and says there's their goalie of the future. So I think that's a concern they have.
Yeah, and if he works out as well as we all expect him to, Askarov is a real game changer. I mean, he is, for me, the best goaltender that has come out since Yzerman took the kid in Tampa Bay, Vasilevsky.
Can you compare Perfetti and Rossi?
Perfetti and Rossi, and the reason that I don't have Stützle clearly ahead of them is I think Rossi and Perfetti are probably the 2 top players in the draft in terms of one key element that sometimes gets overlooked, and that's just pure hockey sense. Their instincts are absolutely impeccable, just off the charts. And while Stützle is a much better skater, probably the best pure skater in the draft, I just think that Perfetti and Rossi are both a cut above him in terms of their pure hockey instincts and hockey IQ in all 3 zones. So, they're similar in one way in that I think that he's listed at about 5'9", 183, Rossi, in terms of his size, and Perfetti is about 5'10", 180. Stützle is a bit bigger than that. He's a legit 6-footer. And as I said, Rossi plays center. Perfetti is a winger more than a center. I think Perfetti could play center. He's that creative with the puck, and he's that imaginative, and his vision is that good. But he seems to be more comfortable and more effective on the wing. So it's kind of comparing apples to oranges when you're anticipating Rossi's going to be a center at the NHL level and Perfetti's going to be a winger. But they're both, for me, the 2 best players in the draft in terms of hockey sense. And, I think sometimes we all get a little bit caught up looking at specifically just physical attributes, his size, his strength, his speed, his skating ability. These 2 kids, Perfetti and Rossi, they don't have the skating ability of a Stützle, but their hockey sense is so off the charts that I cannot see them failing at the NHL level.
Well, every year there's always somebody that, I don't want to say comes out of nowhere, but maybe jumps up the board a lot higher than most people had speculated. Certainly Moritz Seider was that guy with the Wings last year. Who's a guy that right now maybe a lot of people aren't talking about that on draft day might go a lot higher than people expect?
I think there's a couple of guys who might fit into that category. The German kid, John Jason Paterka. Everybody's talking about Stutzla and Reichel as the two big Germans. I think Paterka is kind of the game-breaking goal scorer of the big three of the German group. So I think some teams are kind of lying in the weeds and hoping to pounce on him around 20 or so. And I think if I had to talk about a defenseman, I think is really being overlooked. Perhaps not by NHL teams. It's Ryan O'Rourke in the Sioux. I have him actually as the third defenseman on our list at Red Line Report, right behind Sanderson and Drysdale. He's a kid who plays with a lot more nastiness to his game than I ever thought he had. He's got quite a bit of bite to him. He's got good size, and he was always considered to be an offensive finesse defenseman, which he is. I mean, he's got terrific offensive skills. But he's got a lot more snarl and bite to his game and a lot more, intelligent play in his own end than I had given him credit for coming into the season. He really grew on me.
Well, Kyle, we appreciate having you on the show. Our time's up for this segment, but hopefully we can maybe when the draft is done, get you on to kind of talk about how everyone is done.
Sure, absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Kyle.
See you, Bob. See you, Kevin.
Yep. That's Kyle Woodlief, the publisher and chief scout of the Red Line Report. And like I mentioned coming in, he's a guy that really knows the draft talent and also knows the tendencies. He's been around a long time, and he knows how teams rate. I thought he gave us food for thought on that Red Wings pick, which is the one everyone's looking at. I'm pretty convinced that it's going to go 1, 2, 3 on the top three picks with the three forwards, because I think most people do have Stutzla ranked in the top three. So I would think now that I thought that the Red Wings would have to look at Drysdale versus Perfetti, because there's a lot of undercurrents around Detroit that. The connection, I don't know. Does Devillano own a piece of the?
So does Chris Osgood.
Yeah, and Chris Osgood and all that. And I think they've seen a lot of Perfetti. But I think they want a center. I think there's still I think they think Joe Veleno is going to be a solid, dependable NHL center. But there seems to be some debate about how much of a scorer he's going to be. So it seems to me they would prefer to have a center. Now, I think Kyle's right when he says they're just going to take whoever the highest rated player is, but I think they'd like to have a center.
Well, they've drafted a lot of wingers in the first round in recent years, and now you got a defenseman last year, so you can't take a goalie at 4. So if you're going to pick at 4, it would seem like center's a position of need, certainly for them.
Yeah. Well, and I don't think Steve Yzerman is going to be reluctant to take a smaller player. I mean, he was a smaller player. I was at his first training camp. He was 153 pounds, So that was a different time then. But so I think if the guy can play, the guy can play. So we'll have to see how that goes. But, Bob, I want to talk a little bit about, we've seen in the last 24 hours baseball players say that they're not going to play. We're up to 4 now. We've had 2 members of the Washington Nationals. We've had Desmond in the Colorado Rockies team, and we had an Arizona pitcher whose name escapes me right now. But are we going to see any hockey players? What do you think?
I doubt it. I just think the makeup of a hockey player, it's such a team sport. It really is the ultimate team sport. Everybody's in it for each other. It's not like football where you have second stringers that sit on the bench and only play if somebody gets hurt, or baseball where you're pretty much 8 or 9 regulars other than pitching staff that play every day, and then the guys who fill in. Everybody on a hockey team has a specific role, and they play it every night. And I think there's it's the old story about having all the oars in the water pulling in the same direction. And in hockey, that's more so than any other North American team sport. You can't win without that. And I think that kind of bond, it's almost like a peer pressure in some ways. Like, you don't want to be the guy that stands out from the group. You all kind of want to fit in. And, you always hear hockey players say, oh, they're a great bunch of guys. They're a great bunch of guys. Oh, you never hear them say, well, they're a great bunch of individuals. It's always about the group, the guy, doing things as a group. I think even like things like the White House, you've seen a lot of championship teams in other sports, a lot of players who refuse to go to the White House. You don't see that really in hockey. The only one I can recall was Tim Thomas in the Obama years. But
that's because all, or I shouldn't say all, but most NHL players are Republican.
Yeah, but I mean, they even nailed it when Obama was president too. Like, other than Tim Thomas, it's not, hockey players don't generally like to draw attention to themselves. They don't want to stand out from the crowd, and I think somebody's got to be the first guy. Maybe if somebody did it, then other players would feel comfortable doing it. But if there's not someone willing to be bold enough to take that first step and say, I don't feel right, like you mentioned, Max Domi is. He's a diabetic. He's certainly got a reason to not want to play, but I just don't know that, the fact that you'd feel like you were letting down your teammates would outweigh any personal concerns you have. That's just the hockey player mentality, I think.
Yeah, I'm going to disagree on that a little bit, only that, I think the team factor should just go out the window. I mean, if you have, and a lot of times we don't even know these, but if you got a child who was born prematurely, and of course they would be at risk, and I only know that because my daughter had a premature child, and that was one of the things that was concerning our family about the COVID-19. So I think there will be some, because I think the stuff. While I agree with you, that's how they view things. They're team oriented. They put the team first. I don't think these guys are so callous that if they had a parent living with them with issues, or a child who had a medical issue or something like that, that they wouldn't just say, I can't do it. I mean, think back a couple of years ago when Dominic Moore took off a year and a half to take care of his cancer-ridden wife. I think there are certain things that they put even above. And I think this could be one of them. I don't think we'll see a lot, but I don't think we'll see a lot in other sports too. So, but I think we could see a couple or three, depending on what we don't know. I mean, that's the thing. We don't know what their lives are happening with their lives.
Well, there was, in fact, TSN had Freddie Anderson, an interview with him posted today on their site, the Maple Leafs goalie, and he, without getting into specifics, kind of hinted at he's still not 100% sold on this idea. There's still some things the league hasn't really cleared up, concerns the players have. Again, he didn't get into what specific details were of what those concerns might be, but he didn't sound like a guy who's 100% sold. In fact, he said, I'm not 100% confident in this plan right now. And that's not a good sign when you're literally could be risking your life.
Yeah, no, and we hear all the time. We hear a lot of grousing about people who are or are not wearing masks. But I have found, for the most part, that people sort of know their risk. And I've kind of joked around with some of my friends about. I went to the hardware recently, and within 60 seconds of meeting a man working at the hardware, who was quite helpful, by the way. I knew that his wife was at severe risk if she got the COVID-19 virus. He just volunteered that information. But, it was odd that he shared that with me. But, I was struck by, he knew exactly, what was going on with her, what risk she had because of the virus and so forth if she got it. And I thought about it as I was driving home, and I was saying, I think most people are like that now. They know what their health is, and they know what the risks are. And I think people kind of are assessing that. And I think hockey players are going to be no different. If they have stuff in their lives that they're going to measure it up and decide what's an acceptable risk and what isn't.
I think you say there's a lot of factors that we don't know about with players.
Right.
Do they have maybe somebody's got their parents living with them, and their parents aren't 100% healthy, and they don't want to put them in jeopardy. Or you can say they could have had a baby, or there could have been issues in the childbirth that we don't know about. It's not something that generally gets talked about in the media. Kids that could have issues, whether it be asthma or who knows what. There's all kinds of underlying factors that really the general public isn't aware of that could play a role in a player saying, you know what, I'm just not going to risk it. I'm not going to put my family in jeopardy.
Well, the other problem is we're all standing on shifting sand, when it comes to this virus. Like, Dr. Fauci, who many of us have decided is the guy that we trust, and Fauci we trust. He said apparently, according to news reports, that it's possible, given the spread that's happening now, that we could see 100,000 cases a day. Well, if we have 100,000 cases a day, should we be playing sports, professional sports, college sports, little league? I say the answer to that is no. If that's really going to happen, I think it's time to pull the plug, because that's just simply not safe.
And you see the way things are trending in the U.S. right now, and it's not good. And you wonder, that's another story was on TSN today. Bob McKenzie speculating that it seems like there's a possibility that both hub cities could end up in Canada because of those concerns. All of a sudden, there's a spike in Vegas, and Vegas doesn't look like it's the lock that everybody thought it was to be one of the hub cities. That the four cities that seem to be in the hunt right now are Edmonton, Toronto, Chicago, and Vegas. And is it possible Edmonton and Toronto win and all the games are played in Canada?
I think it is possible. I've said for a while now that I think it would be logical to move the hubs to where the virus ain't. And right now, that seems to be Canada, at least in comparison. Now, the only danger of that sort of philosophy is we don't know what the landscape will look like 3 weeks ago. 8 weeks ago, you would have said you should play in Arizona and Florida, and we don't think that anymore. The one thing I would say about Vegas, before we get too carried away with the idea that Vegas could be out because they have an increase, Vegas has the capability of really bubbling up these teams. Like, there are many places in Vegas where you could put an entire team or multiple teams in a hotel environment and make them self-sufficient so they wouldn't have to go out. Now, players have all lobbying for Vegas. And, I've talked about that in the past. Like that, why are you lobbying for Vegas? Like, to me, every city's the same if you're staying in your hotel room. So if you're lobbying for Vegas, what that's telling me is you might be thinking you're going to cheat and sneak out the back door. And we certainly can't have that.
No, I mean, like we've talked about it, what happens to that team that, say in the second round, the best of sevens, one team sweeps and they're sitting around 7-10 days waiting for a best of seven series to end. That's when I think these guys will get itchy and antsy to want to do something. And that's when you could have trouble. When they're in game mode, when they're in the midst of a series, they're going to be laser focused on winning that series. It's when they've got that downtime between series. I think that's when, the whole bubble could be in jeopardy.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on that. But I think there are a lot of the athletes are anxious to get going. Like, we've been talking about the very small number that think it's too great a risk. But for the most part, I think the majority are ready to go. And, we often think of athletes as having so much money that if they lost the season, it isn't the end of the world. But you know what? It is for a lot of them, because for a lot of players, as we all know, their careers are short. And, there's a big difference if you're not going to be playing your sport for 19 months. And some of these people live to their paychecks. And if you're making $500,000 a year, but you're living like you are going to make $500,000 for the rest of your career, sometimes you don't have the money to sustain yourself if you're not getting a paycheck. And if they don't play, they're not going to get a paycheck for a very long time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we've seen countless stories about athletes in all sports who end up going bankrupt because as you say, they live to that means when they're making, whether it be 300,000 a year or $1 million a year, whatever it is. They live on, they spend it all and live the lavish lifestyle, and then all of a sudden it stops, and you haven't put anything away for that rainy day. So they're no different than an ordinary person that makes a regular wage who doesn't save and invest in that.
I can say confidently that I would never be one of those athletes. If I made $350,000-$400,000 a year, I'd be living like I make $27,500. Because I'd want that money.
Receiver with the Lions a few years ago, whose name escapes me, and that's what he did. He lived on $60,000 a year and put the rest away, thinking that this career is not going to last forever. And in fact, his didn't even last, I don't think, 3 years. So, he was a wise man.
I wrote Brett Hull's book. It's hard to believe, but it's actually been 28 years ago that I wrote Brett Hull's book. And in that book, he reported, even back then, that he didn't take a dime of his first signing bonus. He put it in an annuity that his stepfather recommended. And I ran into him years later, and I said, how's that annuity doing? And he just smiled. It was worth, obviously a lot of money because it had been in there forever. So, there's a lot more attention being paid now to how to manage money. Like I have been on panels when rookies go to be taught. I've been on media panels, and I've gone to some of the other seminars. And one of them that I went to where they talk a lot about how much money you need to save if you don't want to end up having to have difficulty later on. Well, anyway, we've as usual have run out of time, and my dogs are getting noisy, so it's probably time to go anyway. So thanks everyone for listening. We'll be back on Thursday.
All right, everybody. Have a great day.